Okay. Alrighty, and I will take attendance, and then we will dive back into our thrilling lecture about reliability. Yeah, we kind of get through sort of the important but a little bit more drudgery parts at the beginning of the semester, and then we get to really dive into the fun stuff, learning about the different types of questionnaires and tests, and then you all get to give them to each other. So thank you for bearing with me this first part of the semester. Alrighty, Ashanti. In here, Debbie is here. Rose is here. I got Elijah here. Okay, Terrence. Jalen. Anissa. Carry on. Did I say it right this time? Awesome. I literally wrote it down phonetically for myself, so I couldn't F it up. Haley and Brittany. All right. We're just yes, sorry. I think I immediately assumed it was everything because it wasn't in my class before this. But you are credit complete. You're good. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, I forget that there are like more than one Erin or more than one Julia in the classes. So. Alrighty, so we're gonna dive on back into this lecture today. Let me go ahead and get our captions up. Alrighty, so we have been talking about, just to back us up a slide, we've been talking about correlations and we've been talking about what scatter plots look like and what do we use them for and what are some of the problems with the data that we get, right? There are cases where we have limited range, right? So if we're only looking at people who got accepted to college and how their SAT score relates to their GPA, we're missing part of the variability, right? Because there are certain people we're just not letting in because of their scores. Really interesting in terms of, you know, there are some places that have gone test optional over the past 5-10 years or so just to make things easier, more accessible. Some do it if you have a certain GPA, for example. But a lot of people went test optional last year just because people couldn't get to take the tests, right? So, you know, it'll be interesting, and I know there are educational researchers doing this research. It will be interesting to see how this advances, right? Like, how does that impact how people do? My personal opinion is that I don't think being test optional, not having a great SAT score is really going to affect people that much, honestly. The SAT in particular kind of measures how well you take a test. And we'll talk later in the semester about, yeah.
I actually never took that.
There you go. You're good to go. Yeah, did you take the ACT or just neither of them?
No.
Okay, awesome, good. I'm sort of anti-standardized tests. I understand why people use them as like a metric to try to compare, but there's a lot of cultural bias. So we were talking about cultural bias last week, right? Basically measures like how well do you take a test? And so the people who tend to do well are people who go to well-funded school districts. They tend to be affluent, more white than other school districts. And the people who can afford specialized tutoring that teaches you how to take these standardized tests, right? Which again, you have to be pretty affluent to do. So, yeah, I think that, you know, it's not necessarily going to equate to a disaster, as some people think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think business partners are saying, I think there's a lot to that, just because when I was in high school, they really think I would amount to anything. So they just figured that me taking those tests wouldn't really matter. So they just were just like, all right, well, as long as you graduate, you get.
Yeah, and I think that people are often misadvised like that, right? that there's an assumption, sometimes it's racially made, sometimes it is made based on attitude, things like that, right? That like, oh, well, you won't go to college, you won't amount to anything, so whatever. Or the opposite, right? So like I remember I was lucky, this is part of my privilege, I went to a private high school, and they expected you to go to a certain caliber of school. And like, I just wanted to go to a liberal arts college, like y'all are doing. And they were kind of like, well, I don't know if those schools are good enough for you. And I just wanted to be like, F you. Like, I'm gonna go where I want to go and I'll be fine, right? And actually I went to Kenyon, which has a pretty good reputation, but it's sort of like in the middle of nowhere, not many people have heard of it. When I got hired here, the then Vice President for Academic Affairs name dropped Kenyon at least 10 times during my interview. Oh, we love Kenyon. We want to be like Kenyon, right? So like, you never know what's going to help, what won't. I think what will be really interesting is a lot of graduate schools for the first time with GRE optional. And that opened up the field. They got a lot more applications than usual. It actually got to be pretty hard for them to decide, hard for people to get in. But I would hope that means they're getting a more diverse population than they typically would, right? So again, people are going to be doing research on this. I think it'll be really interesting to see from here on out. Alrighty, so the last sort of sidebar here with correlation I wanted to talk about is the coefficient of determination, which is often just called shared variance. So you take the correlation coefficient, that R that we were talking about on Friday, and you just square it. So the square root of 0.8, or the square 0.8 squared, there we go, not the square root, is 0.64. And so if you have a really high correlation at 0.8, your coefficient of determination, your R squared, would be 0.64. So this is an assumption of, I'm just going to put this on silent, sorry, because that's almost as bad as me having sound on when it's on that table. It's supposed to be a statement about factors that underlie the variables that account for the relationship. So it's essentially saying, okay, so if a correlation is this high, if we square it, it essentially means these two have this much in common, essentially. Like this is where how much these two variables overlap. So you can think of the shared variance. Oh, I do have some chalk. I'll move over here so it's not on the computer. And essentially, if you drew a Venn diagram, right? So like for some variables, variable 1 and variable 2, their shared variance might be pretty small. But if you've got something like depression and anxiety, right? Well, 0.72, right? That's almost 3/4. So I'm going to try to make a good estimate here. Not great, but you know, this would be your 0.72. This would be your anxiety. This would be your depression, right? So they're sharing a lot of things in common. It doesn't mean they're not separate things. No one would argue that depression and anxiety shouldn't be separate diagnoses, for example. But it means that there's a lot of stuff that underlies both of them or may account for both of them. So just thinking from your psychological minds, what are some of the factors that might underlie both of these that would maybe someone with depression and someone with anxiety would share? Yes, huge one, right? How we all feel right now in the pandemic that will go away. Overwhelmed. Stress, yes, definitely. Yes, oh my gosh. So not only is that just like such a good determination, there's actually like some great research about that in terms of like the thoughts that you have actually like perpetuate your diagnosis, right? So like circular thinking, just thinking the same things over and over and not really getting anywhere under like both of these, definitely great example.
Motivation and sleep disturbances.
Yes, so sleep disturbances, both of them, you can have a hard time falling asleep, staying asleep. and motivation. Both of them, it can be really hard to get stuff done. Depression, it might be because you just don't feel like getting up and doing anything. Anxiety might be because you're almost like paralyzed by your anxiety to do anything. Yeah, both of these are what sort of old school psychology speak would call internalizing disorders, which means you have a pathology where all the symptoms are headed inwards, right? There are externalizing disorders, and these are like kids' behavioral issues, people who use alcohol and substances, where like your pathology can actually affect other people, right, physically. But these are examples of where you turn all that stress in your life kind of back on yourself. And it's not something you're consciously doing, obviously, but yeah. In fact, there are certain types of depression and anxiety, in particular major depressive disorder and an anxiety disorder called generalized anxiety disorder, that the symptoms overlap so much that if they emerge at the same time, you can't diagnose someone with both. You have to determine which one they have. Now, let's say there's someone who has always been anxious and then they become depressed, you can still diagnose them with both then. But like if their symptoms just emerged a couple months ago, you have to figure out which one is predominant, essentially. So that becomes really important as we look at things like reliability, like validity in particular, when we're looking at, correlating things with existing measures, right? Like, okay, how much variance are they sharing? Is this really adding to our knowledge? Like, is creating this new test or measure actually going to be helpful? Yeah, there's a better Venn diagram than mine. Alrighty, so into reliability more here. So remember from Friday, reliability is the cluster, right? It is, do all your arrows hit the generally the same spot on the target? So ideally, it would also be the bullseye, right? But reliability doesn't really get at that. That's validity. Reliability is just, are you measuring things? Are you hitting things consistently? So consistency, reliability is consistency. That's the simplest definition of it. Other times people will talk about it as stability. Some people will talk about it as repeatability. If I give you a measure today and tomorrow, we should get similar scores, if not the same score. And the really interesting thing is that we're going to talk about reliability as related to measures. But in psychology, you'll also hear people talk about the reliability of like results you get from a study or a test, or reliability of a construct or an idea. These all relate back to the reliability of that test or measure, right? So we are going to stick with that definition for the purposes of this class. So essentially, the reliability of a measure is the consistency of that measure. So when we're looking at reliability, we want to know, does our measure get the same answer every time? And every time can have some flexible meaning. So every time can be different occasions of testing, as I just mentioned, today and tomorrow, today and 2 weeks from now. It can be different people who we'd expect to score similarly, or it can be different items on the same test. And that's often where we start with reliability, is just, are all the different items, all the different questions, say, on a test that the test is supposed to be measuring one thing, are all these items actually measuring one idea or close together at hitting that target? So again, we're thinking about the measure here, and do we get that same answer every time? Part of what goes into this is test score theory. And this can be a little bit difficult to wrap your head around at first. So this comes from the idea of error that exists in psychological research. Why do we talk about error when we talk about research? Aren't we just trying to be perfect? And should we not have to worry about the WSU shaking your head? What do you think?
No. Okay. And
Right.
so you're gonna get different answers depending on things that are going on in their life as they change. So, right, why, to try to make themselves look better, like, it's just people.
Yeah, especially when we're looking at people. But honestly, in psychology research, even if we were like studying rats, right, we're gonna have some error. And just like a person, maybe that rat wakes up just like cranky that day, and they can. Rats actually have like sensitive humors, they could be tickled. It's kind of interesting. But yeah, so it's gonna happen. It exists, right? And oftentimes it's stuff we just can't control. It could be something like, yeah, the person, like Debbie was saying, coming in, and maybe they have motivation not to tell you the truth. Maybe this is for a legal case and they want to make themselves look better if it's a child custody case. Or if they're trying to get not guilty by reason of insanity, maybe they want to make themselves look super crazy, right? And there could be some funny ways people try to get at that. Because people have different ideas of what they think is supposed to be crazy in their minds. And like sometimes someone's ability to try to fake crazy is a good indication they're not, right? But we have ways to test for that. Sometimes the errors are things that like we do unintentionally, right? So we can unintentionally transmit hints to people, right? It's like people have tells at poker. You know, as a assessor, you might, think you're saying things pretty neutrally, but you might be unintentionally giving away the answer. Or it could be environmental, right? Right now we have a very lovely, calm setting, right? But like the other day we had leaf blowers going on, right? And let's say I'm trying to give someone a assessment that involves attention and memory. They might not do that great if there's leaf blowers right outside the window. And sometimes you can't control for that. I actually know a very good cognitive psychologist who had to throw away a semester's worth of data at one site because they started doing construction they didn't know they'd be doing right outside the window. And so it wasn't that many people because they kind of figured it out pretty quickly. But, even 20 participants in a study where you're trying to recruit 100, right? That's time and energy and money. So that makes it really tough. And if you're assessing this person for their individual purpose, you're not adding it into research, right? You don't want to be in a situation where you just have to check that data. I mean, you don't as a researcher either, but like, it's not like you can just magically get a different version of that person to reassess. Some of the assessments we talk about, like you can re-give to somebody pretty easily. Some of them, like the elaborate intelligence inventories, like there's one set of questions. So if you gave it to someone recently, they might do better the second time, not because you're in a more controlled environment, but just because they remember stuff from last time, right? So basically, there will always be some inaccuracy, some error in our assessments, in our measurements. No matter how perfect we try to be, no matter how careful we try to be, it will always exist. As Debbie said, we're dealing with humans and they're really complex. So part of our job as people who are engaging in the process of assessment is to figure out what that error is. Where is it? Where is it coming from? How do we sort of account for it? So the most basic part of test score theory is that X equals T plus E, which you'll also sometimes see represented as X minus T equals E. These are, if you remember, the basic algebra formulas. So in this, X is our observed score. Observed score is what we get when we give someone an assessment, right? So we could observe it by actually like recording their behavior, right? We could, the observed score might be like how they respond to a questionnaire, right? It is the score you get from that person on that given day. But we always assume the observed score is not perfectly equivalent to the true score, right? That if you could get this person with a perfectly accurate test in the perfect setting on the perfect day, they might score slightly differently. Or if you have a lot of error, they might score really differently, right? And the E here is just the error, So we know there's error that's taken into account. So our observed score is the sum of the true score, but you have to take into account the error, is basically what they're saying. So our observed score is not the true score. It's the true score plus the error that exists. And then the second way to flip this is that the error is essentially the observed score minus the true score. So that difference essentially between the observed score and the true score is your error. And again, we're never going to know exactly what this is, because in order to know exactly what this is, we'd have to actually know what the true score is, right? But by definition, because of error, we can't get to it. It kind of becomes like this weird Google thing, right? You can kind of get stuck in if you think about this too long. So we can only estimate it, essentially. The true score is like, if we could actually like look in someone's mind, not have to get at it through second or third hand methods, what would they actually score? Intelligence, depression, things like that. But we can only get at the observed score, which is dependent not only on error in the environment or the person or us, but error that might be built into the test itself, right? So these are some of the big questions in life, right? Like, why do we actually need to give exams anyway? This is probably something you all have asked yourselves many times. I asked myself many times when I was in school, right? So, what do you think? Why do we make you take exams? It's just torture you. Yeah. Exactly. So it's, are you able to tell me what you've learned, essentially? If your ability to do that might have to do with how well I'm teaching it, right? Might also have to do with how well you studied it. And it could also have to do with how well I constructed the test, right? I could be teaching really, really well, and you could be remembering everything I said, and then I construct a test that asks you all about astronomy, right? And you might be like, that's nice. The hell, right? So yeah, all those things have to go together along with the testing environment, right? Sure, but to find out how much students have learned, and again, as I've mentioned before, if I could create a device that could just look into your minds and identify your true knowledge of the subjects, I wouldn't have to give you an exam. But that would also be creepy and invasive, right? Again, we're getting to like Minority Report, other sci-fi things, right? Big Brother, and I don't want to be any of those things, right? Yeah, I could just like go around with my nifty mind scanner and get a true score. But the true scores would still vary, right? Because of individual difference variables. For some of you, maybe some of this is review, you've heard it in other psych classes, right? So then we know that repetition improves our ability to retain things. And so that might be the thing there. And so there's no way, unfortunately, that I can measure a true score on any test, whether it's an exam for my class, or an IQ test, or a big personality test. When we give an exam in class or a formal assessment instrument, what we're doing is getting an estimate of what you know, or an estimate of your personality, or an estimate of your IQ. And that's where, again, that X that we were looking at, that's the observed score, that's the estimated score. Observed, you could also think of it as the estimated score. It's not the perfect true score, it's just the score that we observe or get. It's an estimate of your true knowledge, ability, personality, etc. And the degree to which observed scores actually reflect true scores can vary a lot, really very considerably. Some tests do a much better job, especially, if we're thinking about things like an intelligence test, right? There's a reason that certain intelligence tests have become the gold standard, because they work, they're consistent, There's a lot of research behind them, right? So they're going to hold up in court because of that. And so we are going to use those when we can. And even on something like an in-class exam, right, you might have some variability. So who can think of a time when you took an exam for any class and when you got your grade, you were pretty darn sure it didn't reflect what you actually knew? I mean, I can, right? Like we all can. All right, and again, it's going to depend on what they ask. If any of you ever took AP exams, right? Like I always felt like students were like, really? That's what you're going to ask me about? I just studied all this other stuff all semester, all year, right? And so what happened in that scenario is that your observed score, the score you got on that exam, was not really reflective of your true score at all.
Happened to me with a teacher I had in college a long time ago that, like, you know, you have read an article and she'd ask, you know, in the article by Dr. Bob, it talked about this, and you're like, yeah, that's what it was, but it wasn't Dr. Bob, it was Dr. Robert, or like something stupid like that. And it's like, why are you purposely trying to trick us with trivial things? It doesn't help us.
Right, right. And there are people who believe in that philosophy. I am not one. Occasionally I'll have a trick answer, but I try to make it really obvious. So for example, I don't think we talk about it in here, so I can tell you this one. When I talk about the Statson curve, which if you're not familiar with it, it's the idea that there's like a normal curve, a kind of U-shaped curve for stress and anxiety and performance. And so like, if you have very little anxiety, you're actually not going to perform very well sometimes because you need a little bit of anxiety to motivate you. But if you have too much anxiety, right, you might be so frozen you can't perform. And so one of my distractors, we call them, that I put in is the Haynes-Fraser test, which is actually just like a guy I knew in high school. That was his lesson, right? So like you can have fun with stuff like that. But because it's a hyphenated name, every time I give a test, I get one person who selects it, right? So yeah, you have people who just don't construct good tests and aren't asking you what they actually taught you, right? Or asking things in such a difficult way. Like I think back to my memories of taking organic chemistry, which like no, I always tell this to Dr. Easter, like I'm not slimy orgo, and like I know some people are really good at it. I was not. It was like the one class I really struggled with in college. And like our average in the class was typically like a 50%. Like it was a 50-point test, and typically the average was somewhere around 25. But like I got a B in the class because I always got somewhere around the average. And he rounded it up to a B for some reason instead of a C. So it's like, I'll take it, right? But like, why? Why do you need? I don't understand that type of testing. Like I try to make my tests so the average is a C. If y'all do better than that, awesome. You know, like if everyone got an A on an exam, maybe I made it a little too easy, or maybe it just means I taught you really well, right? Like, and I often see people's exam scores go up throughout the semester because you learn by exam style, right? It's repetition, even if it's not about the same material. So yes, that's just like my own philosophy here. All right. So on this slide, if you do have the notes printed out or just like on a piece of your notebook paper, write down some of the reasons you can think about why a student's observed score on an exam might be either higher or lower than their true score. So think about issues with the test itself that could affect it, issues with the test taker, the student, that could affect it, something about the environment in which the test was taken, and think about something about how the test was maybe scored or graded. And again, it could be that the score would be higher on an exam than the true score, or it could be lower. So I'll give you all, a few minutes to do that. And then we'll come up with some of the ideas up here. stop there. This doesn't have to be a perfect list, but. All right, what are some things that can go on with the test itself that can make the true score not show up? Yeah.
Well, I think it's what you feel you are prepared for
Mhm.
versus what you actually encounter has a lot to do with how you perform. So sometimes you'll have teachers or professors that will prepare you in a way to where you'll be right on point with what you study versus what you encounter, versus some others where they'll give you, as you pointed out, off-base information and sprinkle in the real information and make you confused to what to study, so you study all this other stuff, and then when you get the actual test, a lot of that's not on. So you feel underprepared.
Right. Yeah. What you just said is actually a result of what we call systematic error, and that's often what we try to concern ourselves with in assessment. So systematic error is there something that like everyone taking the test would run into, right? There's an overall problem. Random error would just be something happened, right, that we can't control. Systematic error is not always something we have thought to control, but something like that is a great example. Yeah, I mean, some professors might know already what they're going to put on the exam, but just sort of focus on a whole bunch of stuff. Other professors might actually think you need to know all of that, but be limited in what they can ask you about on the exam, for example. I try to be very conscientious when I create exams to have like equal number of multiple choice questions from each chapter and things like that. Not all professors do that, I think. So, yeah.
Something I read about was like a big problem is like ambiguous questions or questions that make sense to some, but not to all. Like, you know, material, the question is like worded weirdly or something. You might know the answer but get it wrong because
Yeah, and that's something we'll talk about a little bit later in the semester is test item creation. And like, there are good and bad ways to create test items, even something as simple as like a questionnaire you're gonna answer with a Likert scale of how you feel, right? Like, there are problems you can create. So one of them is called like double-barreled responses, right? So like, let's say you're like, I really hate this and that, right? Well, what if the person really hates this, but not that? Or vice versa, right? How do they respond? So we have to watch for things like that and try not to, and to include that confusion, essentially. Yeah, that's another good example of systematic error for sure. Other things about the test people thought of.
Stress and anxiety.
Yeah,
So
huge
as
one.
you mentioned before, some people are great test takers, where they're not nearly as anxious as others, where they'll perform great in class, participate just fine, but then when they get the test in front of them, then all that stuff goes out the window, and they score not nearly as great as they would if they were performed without that sort of test environment.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So there we have like an interaction between the test taker and the test itself, right? And I think that that's something important to keep in mind too, is that these are not in isolation, right? So you could have systematic error in the test and that it's confusing, right? And might not affect everyone in the class the same way, right? Because if you're someone who's anxious, it might just totally overwhelm you and you can't do well with the rest of the test. Someone else might just bomb that question and do okay on the rest of it, right?
I don't know if but like it would not be a true score because sometimes people are guessing, like completely guessing and they just get it right, like nothing get it right. So like that doesn't mean they actually know it.
Right.
I do that.
Yeah. I always tell people on multiple choice tests, guess, right? You at least have a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right. Then if you leave it blank, you have a 0% chance of getting it right.
I mean,
Mhm.
they'll like train you stuff or like explain certain things and then do it. But kind of maybe you study the wrong material, like you feel confident, but then you get the test and then you're like, I got it.
Right.
And then you shut it and be like, yeah, well, probably should study this or this.
Right, yeah, I think that's a really good point too, is that there can be an overwhelming amount of information and it can be sort of aimed in the right direction or the wrong direction or not any direction at all when you go to study.
So piggybacking on what he said, sometimes it's also just semantics, it's word and just how they structure the text.
Right,
So what you encounter in your notes or in your reading might be the answer that they have up there, but it's just the way they word it.
yeah, this goes back to Lilia's point, I think, yeah.
Right.
That you can poorly word a question and it can be really hard for even someone who knows the answer to answer it correctly, definitely. Yeah, and that is on, we have test scoring on here, but that's really test construction, right? And that's really important element too. Yeah, that like professors sometimes make either bad exams or bad exam questions, right? I've had times where I just chuck an exam question and everyone gets the points on it because I realized afterwards I thought it made sense to me, but it didn't when in retrospect. So, but I know not all professors will sort of like take that into account. Yeah, I think that this is really good points about the test. Anything else about the test itself? All right, well, how about the test taker? What could be going on with the test taker that would make their score look better or worse than it actually is?
I think one of the things that gets me sometimes, like lack of sleep,
Mm-hmm. Huge.
pulling all nighter studying, sometimes then my brain just doesn't fire right. I'm too tired.
Yeah, there are actually studies that show that lack of sleep has the same effects on the brain as alcohol intoxication, right? So like you should be careful if you're driving after you haven't slept for the same reasons, right? But yeah, the things like lack of sleep can really play into your ability to pay attention and show what you know.
I feel like what I do with myself a lot that I hate is I double think. Like I like, and then I'll overthink a question. Like I might be like, oh, this could be the answer, but oh, this could be the answer too. And then I'll mark an answer. Then when I get my test, I'm like, then I should have my answer. But like that was the right one. Like I do that too, because like I will sit on one question and literally just overthink it like a lot.
And then that cuts into your ability to have enough time to do the other
Right.
questions. Yeah, I totally know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that someone escape, like really have something on your life, not thinking about the test. Pretty difficult to do a test. You got other stuff.
Yeah. I mean, pandemic, right, has made it really hard for all of us. And Debbie, I hope you don't mind I share, but I know you said like it was hard for you to take tests at home, right? Because like there are just so many more distractors when there are yeah, your cats, right? Things like that. Pets, other members of your household, right? It really gets in your way. But yeah, even something like a death in your family, right? Or someone that you know is sick, or someone's or you're having a bad day. I remember a time in grad school where I had surgery 3 days before our midterm. And the professor was very nice and said, oh, well, let's reschedule. And I was like, I literally don't have any other time in my schedule, so I'll just take it. I ended up getting an A, and when I opened my score, I laughed out loud. Like probably everyone thought I was crazy, which is really great when you're in a class with other clinical psychologists and training. But it was just like, well, I guess maybe I should have surgery every time I did an exam. Would not recommend. But yeah, I mean, there are just things that happen to folks, right? And sometimes it's just better for you to just do it and do the best you can in that moment. I was just thinking of, I think I told the story in neuropsych last week. I had a student once who, at the end of the exam, was like, I don't know how well I did because I left my glasses in my room. I was like, oh my God, you want to go like get them and fix it? And he was like, no, I just like don't have any time, so I just did it. Like if anything like that ever happened to you, please, I'll like give you extra time, like go get whatever you need. But yeah, stuff like that can happen. Other things.
Something else that has happened to me is like rushing through the test and not going back and checking my answers.
Oh yeah.
And so, you get it back and you're like, how did I get that wrong? And it's like you just like scribbled in the wrong bubble or something. And so I started going over my test every 3 times.
Right. Yeah, if you have time, that's a really good. But yeah, you just like, how did I mark that one? I meant to mark that one.
It's funny that you say that because when I take tests, I take
actually for like standardizing, like multiple choice tests. I remember them saying that in the 90s. I don't know if that's still true, that it was actually better to just like not overthink and like your first instinct was usually right, you know, unless they were like, you looked and you were truly like, oh my gosh, that's clearly the wrong answer, like you just shouldn't bother. So yeah, it can kind of go either way, right? For sure. And it might depend on the type of test, right? If it's an essay test and you're pretty confident in your writing ability, you might be able to just, right? If it's a math test and you know you're prone to like typos essentially when you're doing calculations, you might want to go back and just double check you like carried everything down correctly, right?
I
Yeah.
don't know if this makes sense, but sometimes when I take tests, I kind of sometimes go backwards because I feel like going like for some reason either takes longer or the questions like make me overthink. But sometimes me going backwards actually helps with me, and I feel like the questions are kind of like easier. I don't know why, but sometimes like on certain like subjects I would do that.
Oh, I definitely think so, especially with an essay.
Yep. Yeah. Like I usually put my essays last just because I use like my multiple choice as like a warm up for people. But there are folks who that it's going to benefit you to do the essay first, right? Because like you might run out of time if you're spending all that time overthinking the multiple choice questions. Yeah.
The tests, like I would only do essays first because I would end up rushing through them and trying to like, I gotta write something. And, yeah, I learned that to do that first.
Yeah, and so you have to sort of figure out the strategies that work for you. One thing none of you mentioned because you're all wonderful, ethical people is your true score might be overestimated, right? If you have the answer key, right, or you got the answer from somebody or the test from previous people. Sort of interesting. So in my grad program, I was actually sort of sanctioned to look at the questions because they were always essay questions. So it wasn't like seeing the question would like give you the perfect answer. But like even that sometimes felt weird. Like, is this unethical? I don't know. Right, things along those lines. So yeah, I mean, there are reasons people's observed score could be higher than their true score because maybe sometimes inadvertently, right? You have gotten some information that gives you an inside edge, right? I remember one year I had to be at a conference, I think, and so when Dr. Pruitt was still here, he passed out my tests and he didn't realize that that key was on top, and so he passed that out. And luckily the student was very honest and was like, I don't think I'm supposed to have this. I gave her like extra points for it. But like she could have just been like, yeah, this is fine, it's fine, right? She did. All right, how about the environment? What things in the environment? Yeah.
Something that stresses like a lot of people out is when you're taking tests and someone leaves like in 20 minutes, like they're gone, and then you're just sitting there like, are you kidding?
Yeah, and as a professor, I do have to say there are occasional geniuses who can just knock a test out, but often those people just like haven't given it careful enough consideration. So like on one of my tests, especially if there are short answers or an essay, if you turn it in 20 minutes, you probably like haven't written enough. Like I remember my first year teaching here, I got an essay turned in an exam that was like 3 sentences long. And I was like, do you want to go write more? And she went and wrote like one more sentence. And I was like, oh no. That's when I realized I shouldn't do essays on intro things. So we're giving a little more time. So yeah. I mean, it doesn't always mean what you think it does, but I know the exact feeling you're describing. Because I remember as a student, like, shoot, should I be further than I am?
It could be uncomfortable. Like, you know how some people like you're used to being like in a comfortable space where you can focus, but then like you get into like a classroom setting, it's like a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, part of that actually too is like where you sit in the classroom. There is some research about state-dependent learning. So like one time in grad school, I actually made my best friend move. So I was like, you're in my seat. She's like, oh, I was joking. She's like, and I'm like, no, you're in my seat. You need to move. She was like, okay. I'm like, state-dependent learning. Sorry, fine.
I remember when I was like in elementary school and the teacher was walking around and like linger.
I don't do that for that reason.
Yeah. That, so you feel like you're being like watched. So.
Yeah, I remember part of our job as grad students was, I mean, we were at Pitt State University, huge university, so the intersite classes would be 500 people. Yeah, like luckily they had professors teach them living like the grad students do it, because I feel like that'd be cruel and unusual. But the grad students would be assigned to come in on test days and do that. And I always hated it. It was always like, oh, well, I don't want to like give these people the heebie-jeebies, so.
One thing that's kind of weird is like the silence. Like, I don't know, that's just me, like, the silence just be too much. I had a teacher in high school, he actually put one earphone in,
Oh, nice.
listen to music, and he claimed it like that. Apparently, grades his test score, just like, speaking and listening to.
Yeah, then there could be that, and it depends, like if the music has words, sometimes that affects it, sometimes it doesn't, so. I know, like, for me, if I listen to, like, I like instrumental covers of pop songs when I'm trying to write or study, and that helps me. Yeah, and kind of related to that, sometimes it can go the other way, like, I remember there was a year I was giving an exam, I think it had normal again, and like 3 students were coughing the whole time. One student kept believing to go throw up. And like, this is one of the reasons why I'm like, don't come if you're sick at all. But like, I felt so bad for the other students because it had to be really distracting for them. And I also like solved everything. So I got it back. So I feel like, and I was like, I don't know how to do the test. And Dr. Shirley saying because she had to spray like it's just like, I don't want this right now. All right, well, we'll pick up with this and come up with more environment and about the scoring on Wednesday, and then we'll keep going. This is great conversation.